Good afternoon. I think we're ready to go. All right, good afternoon. I'm Warren Milteer. I'm the author of North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885. I'm going to discuss a little bit about how I came to write this book and then read a couple of excerpts from the book. So, this book that I published this month was a product of my PhD dissertation at the University of North Carolina. I originally came to research free people of color in North Carolina as a result of my interest in my family history. I'm a descendant of free people of color, and so that's how I landed with this particular topic. And my research on my family history eventually led me to write about free people of color as an academic. And so this book, North Carolina's Free People of Color, looks at several aspects of life for free people of color, including their status and origins. And the book has a long time period of coverage looking at free people of color from the colonial period through the late 1800s or after the Civil War, and trying to examine what happens to free people of color after the category of free people of color, which was a important concept in the pre-Civil War period. What happens to people who fell in that category after the war? So I'll wait a few minutes to see if any other people come online for the talk. While I'm waiting, if you would like to ask a question during this session, feel free to post a question and I will try to get to those questions after I complete the reading. That can be done in the comments box. Okay, I see a few more people coming on. So I'll maybe wait one more minute and then I will begin reading. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and get moving. So the excerpts that I would like to read today come from the introduction of my book, as well as from the section of the book dealing with free people of color in the colonial period. In the introduction of my book, I discuss the background of free people of color, their origins, as well as their status. I'm going to focus primarily on the discussion that I have about the status of free people of color. Um, but if you have any questions about their origins or other aspects of life of free people of color, I'd be glad to entertain those after the reading. All right, so starting with the introduction. In 1902, not long after the publication of a series of now-famed works that included The Conjure Woman and Other Conjure Tales, and The Wife of His Youth and Other Stories of the Color Line, Charles Waddell Chestnut sat down to pen a lesser-known article titled The Colored People of North Carolina for Hampton Institute's Southern Workmen. Born to parents who were free persons of color before the Civil War, Chestnut used his intimate knowledge of the population of his study, along with other sources, to describe the social position and ancestral origins of the, quote, free colored people. He wrote that, quote, the status of these people prior to the Civil War was anomalous but tenable. In describing their origins, Chestnut mentioned mixtures between, quote, Negroes, whites, and Indians. He argued that many free people of color, quote, perhaps most of them, were, as we have seen, persons of mixed blood. A careful search through court records, censuses, vital records, church minutes, wills, deeds, newspapers, pension files, and oral histories confirms a picture of life for free people of color remarkably similar to the one described by Chestnut more than a century ago. For over a generation, historians have depicted 18th and 19th century North Carolina and the rest of the American South as regions dominated by strict racial hierarchies. Their versions of the American South usually include three distinct groups: whites, blacks, and Indians, encapsulated in a social hierarchy that placed whites over all other groups. Yet the stories of those categorized as free people of color reveal a more disorderly American South. In the colonial and early national periods, North Carolinians and their laws privileged the free over the enslaved, regardless of the racial categories ascribed to them. While the degree to which free people of color were the legal superiors of slaves varied across time, this book argues that the legal position of free people of color generally remained closer to that of whites than to that of slaves. Orlando Patterson explained that slaves were the, quote, socially dead agents of their masters with no legally recognized connection to kin or ancestors. Historians have repeatedly shown that slaves in every society developed strong social bonds, but none of those relations were legally binding. In contrast, North Carolina law always allowed free people of color, like whites, legal personhood and recognized connection to kin. Even during the 1850s and 1860s, when legal limitations were greatest, free people of color retained numerous privileges unavailable to enslaved persons, including the right to own property, access to the courts, the right to keep their wages, and the freedom to leave the state without permission. Free people of color from the colonial period through Reconstruction faced many social, economic, and legal challenges. Prejudice, poverty, and violence were among their various experiences. Yet these obstacles never condemned them to a position close to slave status. The ability to own real and personal property, seek restitution in the courts, and to maintain legally recognized bonds to family distinguished even the poorest free person of color from the most fortunate slaves. At any moment, the circumstances of an enslaved person could change forever with the death of a master, a collection of a debt, or a master's decision to sell an enslaved person away from all things familiar. Many enslaved people never met such changes in circumstance, but the possibility that lingered over them made their position distinct in comparison to free persons. North Carolinians' attempts to categorize themselves into races imbued with specific legal and social privileges, natural attributes, and values always conflicted with their efforts to understand one another in terms of gender, class, reputation, kinship, and occupation. This internal struggle prevented them from agreeing about the proper social relations between those categorized as white and those classified as free people of color. Across time, radical political figures emerged who preached that free people of color and slaves were part of a degraded race naturally beneath all whites. Yet their ideology fully captured the minds of only some people. Following Chief Justice Roger B. Taney's pronouncement in the Dred Scott decision that people of color were not citizens, white politicians in North Carolina as a whole rejected the opportunity to adopt the radical pro-slavery point of view and instead continued to argue that free people of color were citizens of the state. For many North Carolinians, radical pro-slavery beliefs failed to fulfill the practical needs in certain situations, their practical needs in certain situations to understand their neighbors outside of a racialized worldview. Unlike their radical counterparts, they could still be advocates for slavery, but not use free people of color as scapegoats for societal ills and their bondspeople's agitations. North Carolinians viewed racial categorization as important only in certain contexts. Discrimination based on racial categorization was situational. As a result, for most of the period in which free people of color operated as a category, free men of color who could vote until 1835 had more political rights than white women did. In a society that privileged the wealthy over the poor, property-free people of color had access to exclusive social networks and, for a short period, additional political privileges, such as the right to vote for senators, which neither women nor propertyless white men could access. Skilled free people of color found niches in a labor-short economy and even negotiated with their alleged social superiors. Throughout the period in which slavery existed in North Carolina, free people of color carved out spaces to raise their families, make a living, and sometimes enjoy life's luxuries. They built a variety of social networks with neighbors, free and enslaved, white and of color. Free people of color never made up a segregated racial community of their own, nor did they form a wide alliance with enslaved people. Sometimes the political or social objectives of free people of color and enslaved persons intersected, just as the goals of whites and free people of color overlapped. In the same environment in which some free people of color thrived, others found conditions troubling and occasionally even threatening. The competition of ideas about the position of free people of color among white North Carolinians created opportunities for certain individuals and problems for others. Of course, many free persons of color experienced both ups and downs. Although they were not enslaved, some free people of color found life in North Carolina difficult. Sporadic violence committed by white vigilantes, discriminatory laws, and whites' willingness to enforce those edicts, whites' preferential treatment of other whites, and maybe most importantly, poverty and exploitation, had deep effects on free people of color. North Carolina, like so many other parts of British North America and later the United States, was a society filled with great inequalities and individuals willing to exploit, politicize, and exacerbate social disparities. In a place in which people understood their world through hierarchies of race, gender, and wealth, discrimination always coexisted with opportunity and access. Ideologues and politicians, with the aid of supporters, cultivated coalitions and power by arguing for a society that placed men over women and whites over people of color, and justifying the impoverishment of those with the least access to capital. Furthermore, opportunity and access for one group of people commonly came at the expense of others. The contrasting experiences of well-to-do and poor persons of color, follow Seth Rockman's argument that, quote, the early republic's economy opened up new possibilities for some Americans precisely because it closed down opportunities for others. Radicals were unsuccessful in implementing the most extreme parts of their agenda, such as the mass enslavement or deportation of free persons of color. Yet radical pro-slavery thought made an indelible mark on North Carolina's social and political order. Slavery's most ardent defenders led an attack that gradually chipped away at the legal status of free people of color. As attempts to curb the influence of the slave power grew across the United States, radicals throughout the South, using free people of color largely as scapegoats, intensified their attacks on the privileges and liberties of free persons of color. From the late 18th century, radicals had begun to observe both a national and an international collapse in slavery. The gradual breakdown of slavery in the northern states, the Haitian Revolution, which birthed a republic out of a former slaving colony, the outlawing of slavery in some of Spain's former American colonies, the amelioration and eventual abolition of enslavement in the United Kingdom's vast empire, and the growing anti-slavery movement in the United States demonstrated that Southern slavery was under siege and that slavery more broadly was crumbling. These happenings helped to spur a radical reaction which included attacks on free people of color. Disparaging free people of color was part of a defense of slavery that argued that society should be divided into two parts, one free and white and one composed of enslaved persons of color. According to radicals, this was the natural order. In such a society, there was no room for free people of color. Driven by this ideology, radicals used a politics of fear, fear of a changing social order, fear of collusion between free people of color and slaves, and fear of northern influence on their communities to win elections and push legislation that adversely affected the status of free people of color. The more radicals attacked free people of color, the more forcefully they could argue that they, not their more moderate counterparts, were the most ardent defenders of slavery and therefore the strongest advocates for what appeared to be the South's increasingly distinctive way of life. Legislation that adversely affected free people of color was a politically cheap way to appease constituencies of slaveholders, fearful whites, and white organized labor without dealing with their society's lack of economic diversity, vast wealth inequality, or inability to convince enslaved people, that bondage and its brutalities were their inherent lot. When North Carolina lawmakers enacted legislation discriminating against free people of color, they were followers, not leaders. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, North Carolina's free people of color lived in a place known for its sluggishness and traditionalism. Commonly known as the, quote, Rip Van Winkle state, North Carolina was cash-strapped, undereducated, economically underdeveloped, and late in its expansion of political rights to all white men. Between 1815 and 1850, 1/3 of the state's population, including many free people of color, left for better opportunities to the west. Over 30% of people born in North Carolina lived in other states by 1850. North Carolina's slowness, however, may have been a benefit to free people of color in certain ways. North Carolina was the last southern state to disfranchise free men of color. Legislators in Raleigh also failed to pass further restrictions on the lives of free people of color that appeared in the law books of other southern states, such as limits on real property ownership and requirements to establish relationships with white guardians. North Carolina's less than dynamic political and social development does not preclude its importance in understanding the position of free people of color in the South. Nearly 12.8%, or a little more than one-eighth of the free people of color in the slave states, lived in North Carolina on the eve of the Civil War. North Carolina consistently had one of the largest populations of free people of color in the South, only trailing Maryland and Virginia through most of the pre-Civil War period. So I'm going to stop there with the introduction and move on to Chapter 2. And Chapter 2, as I had mentioned, discusses the situation of free people of color in the colonial period. So the readings that I'm going to do from Chapter 2 highlight the contrast between the position of free people of color who were relatively well-to-do and those free people of color who were at the bottom of society, members of the servant class. When William Chavis of Granville County died sometime in the 1770s, he left an estate of hundreds of acres of land, 11 enslaved women, men, and children, livestock, and numerous trinkets. Chavis was a literate man who owned books and an inkstand. During his life, he operated his own inn or tavern, was politically active, and regularly appeared in the county courts to conduct business. As he was one of the most affluent people in his part of North Carolina, individuals in Granville County continue to remember Chavis's name and legacy at least until the 1890s. In many ways, his life was a model of not only how Britain's American colonial scheme paid off for the British Crown and aristocracy, but also how slavery and the appropriation of native lands could make common men into masters of their own small worlds. William Chavis was the master of his household, a master over men and women, yet he was categorized in his community as a, quote, Negro. Chavis's categorization as a Negro exposed him to discriminatory taxation and probably subject him to the sneers of white people who equated his racial categorization with inferiority. Yet Chavis was still among the fortunate in colonial America, living in a society that assessed human value based on intersecting hierarchies of legal status, slave or free, head of household or dependent, national origin, sex, religious affiliation, reputation, family connection, and skin color. Chavis was far from the bottom of the social order. As a free man and head of household with wealth and respectability, he enjoyed an overall social position above that of most people of color in the colony. And because of the pronounced importance of gender discrimination, legal status, and wealth disparity in the shape of society, Chavis, even as a, quote, Negro, had more political privileges, rights, and power than every woman and girl and every servant or slave, regardless of racial categorization. In colonial North Carolina, free status protected persons of color like William Chavis from the almost unlimited power masters wielded over slaves and firmly placed all free people of color in a legal position above slaves. Social customs and the law created critical distinctions in the life experiences of free persons of color based on sex, servitude status, and personal wealth. The white versus colored racial dichotomy used in theory to divide masters from slaves and the colonizers from the colonized indeed promoted and produced inequality. Yet the colonists' belief in race and a hierarchy of racial categories could only partially dictate the outcomes for those deemed persons of color. As Anne McClintock argued, quote, no social category exists in privileged isolation. Each comes into being in social relation to other categories, if in uneven and contradictory ways. Racial categorization did not overshadow, but instead intersected with gender and wealth. colonial North Carolina lawmakers had not concluded that racial categories were society's most valuable hierarchical concepts. Among the general public were those who were less than fully convinced that categorization as a Negro, mulatto, mustee, or Indian denoted a caste-like second-class status for free persons of color that overrode all other highly valued forms of hierarchy. Now I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and discuss the situation of free people of color who were servants and apprentices in colonial North Carolina. The lives of free people of color who worked as servants and apprentices varied significantly from the experiences of their unbound counterparts. The authority masters had over servants and apprentices limited the possibilities for all bound servants, especially women. Masters had almost unlimited rights to the bodies and labor of their servants, and across the colony they generally sought to take full advantage of those entitlements. The apprenticeship law of 1760 granted apprentices more legal protections than in the past. Nonetheless, they had to depend on a political apparatus that was inherently biased to the master class to protect their rights. Servants and apprentices, regardless of racial categorization, had the right to complain to local courts about abuses by masters. In this arrangement, protecting oneself from the abuse of masters was difficult but not impossible. The historical records suggest that free people of color became part of North Carolina's system of bound servitude largely through the legal actions against their mothers. Free persons of color generally did not enter the servitude system through contractually arranged indentured servitude, as was the case with many European immigrants who paid their passage to the colonies through this method. Across North Carolina, courts bound free children of color to masters as punishment for their mothers having children out of wedlock. The laws punishing women and children for bastardy were part of a long English and later British colonial tradition of regulating the sexuality of the poor and protecting the labor interest of masters who would be responsible for providing housing and provisions for pregnant servant women, whether or not they could work. Even the children who may have been the products of rape or the children of their mother's masters were forced into servitude. Generations of children of color found themselves circumscribed by North Carolina's system of servitude largely as the result of their white female ancestors' perceived sexual indiscretions. The laws of servitude prevented servant women, many of whom were in their reproductive primes, from marrying while obligated to their master's service. As a result, children born to servant white women were bastards, and because North Carolina law required the quote mulatto children born to servant women to be bound out from birth, children known to have fathers who were free people of color automatically joined the servant class. Delaney Bright was one of the children of color who fell into the colonial system of servitude because of the circumstances of her birth, and North Carolina lawmakers desired to control poor servant women and their illegitimate children. On July 10, 1746, Pasquotank County justices bound the 2-year-old Delaney, whom they described as a, quote, mulatto girl, and the daughter of Lydia Bright, a white woman that was killed by a tree that fell upon her, to James Burnham. Burnham agreed to provide Delaney with sufficient meat, drink, washing, lodging, and apparel fit for mulattoes. This agreement between the justices of the court and Burnham demonstrates that North Carolina law provided both local magistrates and masters with broad powers in the lives of young servants of color. By requiring meat, drink, washing, lodging, and apparel fitting for, quote, mulattoes, the justices provided Burnham with legal protection if he decided to treat Delaney as less than the typical white servant. The apprenticeship agreement gave Delaney the opportunity to survive, but did not guarantee that she would have the tools to move beyond the servant status of her youth. Masters' treatment of their servants' indentures as inheritable property cast servants and apprentices firmly below other free persons of color in colonial North Carolina. In his 1753 will, Edmund Chancey of Pasquotank County bequeathed his servants, Jack Spaniard Bow and Spaniel Bow, until their expiration of their indentures, along with livestock and other property to his son Daniel. He also devised Bob Bow, Frank Bow, and Rachel Bow, along with her two children, all, quote, servants, through the periods of their indentures to his daughter Rachel. On May 25th, 1741, the sheriff of Edgecombe County liquidated the estate of Thomas Haynes. Among the items sold to the highest bidders were the, quote, services of David Hall, a free Negro boy until he is 21, and the services of Elizabeth Hall, a free Negro girl till she is 18. So you can see in these examples that I've mentioned in the servants section that the status of servants of color contrasted significantly from the situation of a person like William Chavis. William Chavis was a property holder, and his property included both real estate and enslaved people. He was a master over these enslaved people, whereas the poor free people of color had very few rights and had limited control over their own destinies, let alone the destinies of other people. I'm going to stop here and see about taking any questions that you all might have. It looks like we might be having a little difficulty with the questions. Let's see. All right, we have a question. How were the experiences of free people of color in North Carolina different from free people of color in other states? So, I think one of the major differences that we see with the status and situation of free people of color in North Carolina compared to free people of color in other parts of the South are around their political rights, especially the political rights of free men of color. So in North Carolina, free men of color had the right to vote until 1835. Um, Free people of color also had the right to vote in a few other southern states, including Maryland and Tennessee. Maryland ended the right for free men of color to vote in the early 19th century, and Tennessee ended the right to vote for free men of color right before North Carolina ended that right in 1835. So I think that's one major difference that you see is that at least some North Carolinians are very comfortable with the idea of free people of color voting, especially free people of color who were property holders. Um, North Carolinians, white North Carolinians specifically, seem to have held tightly to older ideas about the importance of class, and the role that class played in determining who was acceptable in society and who was not. So that's definitely a major contrast that I see in North Carolina compared to some other areas. Let's see, what opportunities were available to free people of color in the West? I'm going to assume that that question is specifically about free people of color in the mountainous area of North Carolina. I'll answer it in that way, and if not, please follow up with me. So, in the North Carolina mountains, free people of color were a much smaller population than they were in the east and in the Piedmont region of the state. So, most free people of color could be found in eastern counties on the coast and in the northeast region near the Virginia border, as well as the southeast region on the border with South Carolina. You also have a large number of free people of color in areas such as Granville County, Wake County, which are closer to the Piedmont region. As far as in the West, the few free people of color that are in that area are doing a variety of different things. There are free people of color who move to the West and work in trades. You even see free people of color who were involved in mining. That could be gold mining, coal mining. Um, some people are farmers in those areas. There are many communities where free people of color are, for lack of words, nearly invisible. There may only be 5 free people of color, 10 free people of color in a single county. In certain other areas, you may see a few hundred. Let's see. Can you go a little bit more into the different privileges wealth afforded free people of color in North Carolina? Sure. So, with free people of color in North Carolina, there's more evidence of what free people of color are able to do in the post-colonial period, so in the 19th century. Free people of color, beyond just purchasing property, both real estate property, and enslaved people, often used the money and wealth that they had to invest. So there's certain free people of color who own stocks and bonds. You see free people of color who are able to send their children to college, which is very unusual for any North Carolina resident in the early to mid 1800s. So that's one major contrast that I see is the education, the access to education that wealthy free people of color are able to provide for their children, compared to what you see poor people of color being able to do. Did you find anything surprising during your archival research? Wow. Yeah, I found a lot of surprising things during my archival research. Let's see, I think maybe the oddest thing that I found during my archival research was something I found in a court case. This was a court case, I believe, from the 1850s. And mixed in the court papers was a clipping of somebody's hair. And so what had happened in this court case is that there was a free woman of color who I discuss in this book, in my book, who had been charged with killing her baby. And there was a clipping of the baby's hair in the file. So I would say that is the biggest surprise that I have found in my archival research. What projects are you working on now? So I'm currently working on a book manuscript about free people of color in the South more broadly. So I'm trying to go beyond North Carolina in my examination of the status of free people of color and the political situation of free people of color and how white politicians discussed and dealt with free people of color and their communities. So that's my next project. And that I came to the conclusion that I should do that project partially as a result of questions that I received about this project on North Carolina. So many historians are often interested in how one region's situation relates to the situation in other regions. And so I'm trying to at least partially answer that question with my new project. All right, well, that seems to be all of the questions that we have for today. I greatly appreciate all of you all turning in. And if you're interested in learning more about my book, please go to lsupress.org and you can find more information there. Thank you and have a good day.